Betrayal at 30,000 feet, the sister who never was. The private jet touched down on the rain-slicked runway of Washington Dulles International Airport as camera flashes illuminated the gray October sky. President Jonathan Sterling emerged first, his practiced smile firmly in place, waving to the assembled crowd. Behind him came First Lady Victoria, elegant in navy blue, followed by his younger sister, Captain Rebecca Sterling, resplendent in her Air Force dress uniform, medals gleaming under the lights. This was supposed to be a triumphant return from a successful European diplomatic tour. Instead, within 48 hours, this photograph would become the most infamous image in American political history. The last moment before a secret 3 decades in the making would detonate like a bomb, destroying everything it touched. The perfect American family. For 6 years, President Jonathan Sterling had embodied the American dream. At 52, he was handsome, charismatic, and seemingly incorruptible. His approval ratings consistently hovered around 70%. His State of the Union addresses inspired millions. His personal story resonated with voters across every demographic. The son of a single mother who had worked 3 jobs to put him through college, who built a successful law practice, served 2 terms as governor, and ascended to the highest office in the land through sheer determination and talent. Victoria Sterling, his wife of 28 years, was equally beloved. A former emergency room physician, she had given up her medical career to support her husband's political ambitions while championing healthcare reform and veterans issues. Their marriage was held up as a model of partnership and mutual respect. And then there was Rebecca. 20 years younger than Jonathan, she was America's darling, a decorated Air Force pilot who had flown combat missions in 3 theaters of war, earning a Silver Star for valor. She had been the first woman to command an elite fighter squadron, and her rise through military ranks had been meteoric. At 32, she was the youngest captain in her unit and being fast-tracked for promotion to major. The media loved the Sterling family narrative. Photographs of Jonathan and Rebecca together, the proud older brother and his accomplished younger sister, appeared regularly in newspapers and magazines. They seemed to represent everything good about America: hard work, dedication, family bonds, and service to country. But beneath the polished surface lay a truth so ugly, so devastating, that when it finally emerged, it would shake the nation's faith in everything. The journalist's discovery. Melissa Chen had been investigating political corruption for the Boston Herald for 15 years. She had broken major stories about campaign finance violations, corporate malfeasance, and government waste. She prided herself on her instincts and her relentless pursuit of truth. So when an anonymous package arrived at her office, containing a single photograph and a cryptic note, those instincts told her to pay attention. The photograph showed a teenage girl, maybe 16, holding a newborn baby. The girl's face was partially obscured, but something about her features was hauntingly familiar. The note read, "Captain Rebecca Sterling was born Rebecca Maria Gonzalez. The president is not her brother, he's her father. The truth is hidden in Riverside County, California. Birth records from 32 years ago. Look for Maria Gonzalez, age 16, infant girl, no father listed." Melissa almost dismissed it as another conspiracy theory. She received dozens of similar tips every month, 99% of which led nowhere, but something nagged at her. She pulled up photographs of Captain Rebecca Sterling and studied them carefully. Then she looked at the anonymous photograph again. The similarities were undeniable. Melissa booked a flight to California that same day. Unraveling the thread, what Melissa discovered over the next 8 months would consume her entirely. She took a leave of absence from the newspaper, maxed out her credit cards, and dedicated every waking hour to following a trail of evidence that grew more damning with each discovery. The official records stated that Rebecca Sterling was born to Jonathan's mother, Margaret Sterling, when Jonathan was 20 years old. Margaret had supposedly been in her mid-40s at the time. Possible, but unusual. The birth certificate listed Margaret as the mother and no father. But Melissa found inconsistencies everywhere. Hospital records from the facility where Rebecca was supposedly born showed no admission for Margaret Sterling during that period. The attending physician listed on the birth certificate had died 10 years ago, conveniently unable to verify or deny the information. Digging deeper, Melissa found a different birth certificate, the original one, filed in Riverside County, California. It listed the mother as Maria Gonzalez, 16 years old, occupation domestic worker, father unknown, the baby's name Rebecca Maria Gonzalez. Then Melissa found Maria herself. Maria's story. Maria Gonzalez lived in a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Los Angeles. She was 48 years old, worked as a housekeeper at a hotel, and had lived in the same building for 26 years. She was undocumented, having come to the United States from Mexico at age 14 to escape poverty and violence. When Melissa knocked on her door, Maria's face went pale with terror. "Please," she whispered in accented English. "Please, I cannot talk about this. They will hurt me. They will take away everything." It took 3 visits before Maria finally agreed to speak, and only after Melissa promised to protect her identity until the story was published. What Maria revealed was heartbreaking. At 15, Maria had been hired to clean the house where Jonathan Sterling lived while attending law school. He was 20 years old, ambitious, and already planning his political future. Maria was shy, spoke little English, and sent most of her meager wages back to her family in Mexico. Jonathan began paying attention to her. At first, it was friendly, helping her with English, asking about her family. Then it became more. He told her she was beautiful. He bought her small gifts. And then, one night when no one else was home, he did what powerful men have done to vulnerable young women throughout history. Maria became pregnant at 16. She was terrified, alone in a foreign country, and completely under Jonathan's control. When she told him about the pregnancy, everything changed. He was so angry, Maria recalled, her hands shaking as she spoke. He said I would ruin his life, that I was trying to trap him. Then his mother came to talk to me. Margaret Sterling had been a formidable woman, wealthy, connected, and determined to protect her son's future. She made Maria an offer that wasn't really an offer at all. Accept money to leave California, give up all rights to the child, and never speak of Jonathan's involvement. If Maria refused, Margaret would have her arrested and deported, ensuring she would never see her baby at all. I was 16, undocumented, and alone, Maria said, tears streaming down her face. What choice did I have? The adoption that never was. Margaret Sterling orchestrated an elaborate deception. Maria was sent to a facility in Arizona to give birth, far from anyone who might recognize her. The moment Rebecca was born, she was taken from Maria's arms. Maria was allowed to hold her daughter for exactly 10 minutes before lawyers appeared with papers to sign. The baby was then transported to Washington, D.C., where Margaret lived. A falsified birth certificate was created, listing Margaret as the mother. Money changed hands at multiple levels: hospital administrators, county clerks, state officials. Margaret's wealth and connections made the impossible possible. 20-year-old Jonathan continued his law. Studies, his reputation and future intact. Margaret raised Rebecca as her own daughter, telling everyone that she had become pregnant unexpectedly in her mid-40s. It was unusual, certainly, but not impossible. and no one questioned the sterling reputation of the Sterling family. When Margaret died 12 years later, 14-year-old Rebecca went to live with Jonathan, who had by then married Victoria. She grew up believing Jonathan was her older brother. Margaret had been her biological mother, and her father was unknown. A brief romance Margaret never spoke about. Rebecca idolized her brother. She worked tirelessly to make him proud, excelling in school, earning an appointment to the Air Force Academy, and dedicating her life to service. Everything she achieved was motivated by a desire to honor the Sterling family name and live up to Jonathan's example.
She had no idea her entire identity was a lie.
The story breaks. Melissa Chen published her investigation on a Monday morning in October. The Boston Herald ran it as their front-page story, but within minutes, every major news outlet in America had picked it up. The headline was simple and devastating. President's sister is actually his daughter. DNA evidence reveals 32-year deception. The article included copies of both birth certificates, DNA evidence Melissa had obtained through sources she declined to name, testimony from 5 people who had been involved in the original cover-up, and photographs documenting the timeline. Most damning of all were quotes from Maria Gonzalez, finally telling her story after 3 decades of enforced silence. The nation's response was immediate and explosive. Social media erupted. News networks interrupted regular programming. The stock market dropped sharply as investors panicked about political instability. International allies expressed shock and concern. Congressional leaders from both parties demanded answers. Within 3 hours, #SterlingLies was trending worldwide. Within 6 hours, calls for impeachment were echoing through the Capitol. Within 12 hours, protests had erupted outside the White House, with crowds demanding the president's resignation. President Jonathan Sterling's initial response was predictable: complete denial. His press secretary called the story a malicious fabrication by enemies of this administration. His lawyers threatened legal action against the Boston Herald. He released a brief statement calling the allegations categorically false and deeply offensive. But the evidence was overwhelming. And as more witnesses came forward, emboldened by Melissa's reporting, the wall of lies began to crumble. Rebecca learns the truth. Captain Rebecca Sterling was on a training exercise at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada when the story broke. She had just finished a briefing when her commanding officer, Colonel James Murphy, asked to speak with her privately. His face was grave, and Rebecca immediately knew something was terribly wrong. "Rebecca," he said gently, "you need to see something." "I'm so sorry." He handed her a tablet displaying the Boston Herald article. Rebecca read it standing up, her face expressionless, her military training keeping her composed even as her world disintegrated around her. She read about Maria Gonzalez, 16 years old and vulnerable. She read about Jonathan Sterling's abuse of power. She read about Margaret's cover-up, the falsified documents, the money paid to officials. She saw the DNA evidence proving conclusively that Jonathan was her biological father, not her brother. She looked at the photograph of Maria holding a newborn baby, holding her, and saw her own features reflected in the young girl's face. "This can't be real," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew it was true. So many small inconsistencies throughout her life suddenly made sense. The way Jonathan sometimes looked at her with an expression she could never quite identify. The way Victoria had always been kind but slightly distant. The fact that she looked nothing like any photographs of Margaret Sterling. Rebecca walked out of Colonel Murphy's office, made it to the women's restroom, locked herself in a stall and vomited. Then she collapsed onto the cold tile floor and sobbed. Deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to tear her apart from the inside. the woman who had flown fighter jets through enemy fire, who had commanded dozens of men and women in combat, who had stared down death without flinching, completely shattered. Everything she knew about herself was a lie. The president's confession, President Jonathan Sterling held out for 4 days, maintaining his denial even as more evidence mounted and political pressure intensified. But when 3 former staff members of his mother's household came forward with corroborating testimony, and when DNA evidence obtained from Rebecca's military medical records was matched against samples collected from discarded items at the White House, he finally had no choice. On Friday evening, he addressed the nation from the Oval Office. He looked 20 years older than he had just a week before. Victoria was not present. She had moved out of the White House residence 2 days earlier and filed for divorce. "My fellow Americans," he began, his voice hollow, "I stand before you tonight to confirm what many of you have already concluded. The reporting by the Boston Herald is accurate. Captain Rebecca Sterling is my biological daughter, not my sister. Her mother is Maria Gonzalez, who was 16 years old when I impregnated her. I was 20. The confession continued for 35 minutes. He detailed how his mother had orchestrated the cover-up, how he had allowed it to happen because he was young, ambitious, and cowardly. He admitted to paying Maria money for years to maintain her silence, to creating documents that falsified his daughter's identity, and to perpetuating the lie for 3 decades. I took advantage of a vulnerable young woman who had no power to resist me," he said, his voice breaking. "I allowed my mother to steal her child and buy her silence. And I let my daughter grow up believing a fundamental lie about who she was, all to protect my political career." He announced his immediate resignation, making Vice President Richard Hammond the nation's new president under circumstances no one could have imagined. But the damage was done, to the country, to the institution of the presidency, and most of all, to the young woman whose life had been built on lies. The aftermath, the legal consequences were swift and severe. Federal prosecutors brought charges against Jonathan Sterling in multiple jurisdictions: sexual abuse of a minor, fraud, identity theft, bribery of public officials, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. His legal team negotiated a plea agreement that included 15 years in federal prison and forfeiture of all presidential benefits. Numerous officials who had participated in the cover-up faced their own criminal charges. Over the next 18 months, 23 people were indicted on various offenses related to the scandal. The civil lawsuits were even more devastating. Maria Gonzalez's attorneys filed suit seeking damages for 32 years of enforced silence, emotional distress, and theft of her parental rights. Rebecca filed her own suit for fraud, emotional distress, and identity theft. Both cases settled for amounts reported to exceed $100 million each. But no amount of money could repair what had been broken. Victoria Sterling, the ultimate collateral victim, released a single statement: "I devoted 28 years of my life to a man I thought I knew. Every moment of our marriage was built on a lie. My heart breaks for Rebecca and Maria, and I hope they can find peace, though I'm not sure I ever will." Rebecca's journey captain, Rebecca Sterling, or Rebecca Gonzalez, as she would later legally rename herself, resigned her Air Force commission despite widespread pleas for her to reconsider. Military leaders, senators, and even the new President Hammond urged her to stay, insisting that her service record was exemplary and earned through her own merit. "I can't wear this uniform anymore," she told Colonel Murphy in her resignation letter. "Every time I look at it, I see the lies. I don't know who I am, and I can't serve my country until I figure that out." She entered intensive therapy, struggling with PTSD, depression, and a complete identity crisis. Dr. Sarah Martinez, her therapist, would later write a book about complex trauma and identity, with Rebecca's permission, that described the unique psychological damage caused by discovering one's entire identity was fabricated. Rebecca had to rebuild her sense of self from nothing, Dr. Martinez wrote. Every memory was contaminated. Every achievement was questioned. The man she had idolized as her brother was actually the father who had abandoned her. The woman who raised her was her grandmother, not her mother. Her real mother had been silenced and separated from her for 32 years. It's a level of betrayal that most people cannot comprehend. The healing process was agonizing and ongoing. Rebecca withdrew from public life entirely, declining all interview requests and media appearances. She changed her appearance dramatically, cutting her hair short, getting tattoos, adopting a style completely different from the polished military officer the world had known. Meeting her mother 8 months after the scandal broke, Rebecca traveled to Los Angeles to meet Maria Gonzalez for the first time. No press was notified, no cameras were present, just two women whose lives had been destroyed by the same selfish, powerful man, meeting as mother and daughter. Maria opened the door of her small apartment, and they stood staring at each other for a long moment. Rebecca saw her own eyes, her own hands, her own smile in this small woman's face. All the features she had been told came from the Sterling side actually came from here, from this woman who had been robbed of the chance to raise her. "Mija," Maria whispered, the Spanish word for my daughter breaking on a sob. "My baby girl." Rebecca fell into her mother's arms and they held each other, crying 3 decades worth of tears. They had lost 32 years. Years that should have included birthday parties and school plays and graduation celebrations and all the ordinary moments that build a mother-daughter bond. But they had now, and while it couldn't replace what had been stolen, it was something. Over the following months, Rebecca moved to Los Angeles to be near Maria. They spent hours together daily, building the relationship they should have always had. Maria taught Rebecca to cook traditional Mexican dishes and speak better Spanish. Rebecca helped Maria apply for legal residency, a process made easier by the public sympathy for her story. They went to therapy together, separately, and slowly began healing from a trauma that had marked both their lives indelibly. The national reckoning to the Sterling scandal forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the vulnerable people destroyed when wealthy men face no consequences. It became a cultural watershed moment, referenced in books, films, television shows, and countless academic papers. Advocates for immigrant rights used Maria's story to highlight how undocumented young women were particularly vulnerable to exploitation, with no recourse when powerful men abused them. The scandal illuminated how wealth could literally purchase different realities, how documents could be forged, identities manufactured, and truth itself could be bought when enough money changed hands. Child welfare organizations pushed for comprehensive reform of birth certificate and adoption laws, using Rebecca's case to demonstrate how easily records could be manipulated. New federal legislation, nicknamed Rebecca's Law, created stricter oversight and verification requirements for birth certificates, with criminal penalties for falsification. The military conducted an extensive review of Rebecca's career, concluding that, while her admission to the Air Force Academy had been facilitated by the Sterling name, every one of her achievements, her flight certifications, her combat missions, her medals, her promotions, had been earned entirely through her own skill and courage. This gave Rebecca some measure of comfort. At least her professional accomplishments had been real. 3 years later, 3 years after the scandal broke, Rebecca Gonzalez sat in her mother's kitchen in Los Angeles, helping prepare dinner. She had gained weight, looked healthier, and smiled more easily. She worked as a flight instructor at a small airport, teaching civilians to fly, still in the air where she had always felt most free, but now on her own terms. Maria had completed her degree in early childhood education and worked at a bilingual preschool. Mother and daughter lived in adjacent apartments in a modest building. Their lives finally intertwined as they always should have been. They had both testified at Jonathan Sterling's sentencing hearing. Maria's testimony was brief but powerful. "You stole my daughter in 32 years of our lives together. No prison sentence will ever be enough." Rebecca had said nothing, unwilling to even look at the man who had destroyed so many lives to protect his own ambitions. Jonathan Sterling was now serving his 15-year sentence at a federal facility in Pennsylvania. He wrote to Rebecca monthly. She had never opened a single letter. Victoria Sterling had retreated entirely from public life, living quietly in Vermont and declining all media requests. The last public photograph of her showed a woman who looked haunted, broken by the revelation that her entire marriage had been built on lies. As for Rebecca, she was learning to live with the complicated truth of her identity. She was Rebecca Gonzalez, daughter of Maria Gonzalez, a survivor and a fighter. She was also the woman who had been Captain Rebecca Sterling, decorated Air Force pilot. Both identities were real, both were hers, and she was slowly learning to integrate them into a whole person. "It's strange," she told Dr. Martinez in one of their sessions. "I spent my whole life trying to be worthy of the Sterling name. Now I realize the Sterling name was never worthy of me. The healing would continue for years, probably forever. The scars would never fully fade. But Rebecca had something she'd never had before: the truth, her mother, and the freedom to build an authentic life on her own terms. And sometimes, late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she would sit with Maria in comfortable silence, holding her mother's hand, and feel grateful that despite everything, despite all the lies and betrayal and stolen years, they had found their way back to each other." The photograph from that October day, the last image before the secret exploded, remained one of the most viewed images in internet history, a permanent reminder of how even the most perfect-seeming families can hide the darkest secrets, and how the pursuit of power can destroy innocent lives without hesitation or remorse.